Jorge, and then Kareem. Jorge, welcome, man. You're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you a challenge because we've spoken a lot of times, and you can still make the same point, but I'm gonna make you a challenge. I'm gonna ask you your views on Israel-Palestine without using the term intellectual error or intellectual mistake.
Ooh. Can I use fallacies instead?
I was just kidding. I want you to take it from a different angle, but no, you give 60 seconds to explain your thing, and then I'll ask you some questions about it.
Right. Okay. So my 60 seconds. So I believe Zionism in general is just a flawed ideology, just like socialism. A flawed ideology that made sense to a lot of bright people. I believe that the state of Israel had as much a right to exist as the Soviet Union. And but it's very important to see anti-Semitism for what it is. It's a set of intellectual errors or fallacies that can be easily overcome through reason and logic, just like we overcame slavery, unequal treatment of women, and so on. And a couple of the very popular ones that everyone has heard of, for example, Jewish overrepresentation in finance and banking, because the Islamic world and the Christian Catholic Church back in the day, they made it a criminal act to charge interest on loans, inadvertently turning over the entire sector to the Jews, giving them immense influence. When the whole Western world is giving you their savings, you're going to have a little bit more influence. Also, Jewish overrepresentation in the Bolshevik Revolution, just because some people are overly represented in a flawed ideological movement, it doesn't mean that they purposely did it, right? So those are just two very popular fallacies that can be easily overcome. So now how do we overcome fallacies? Through reason, logic, education, and sympathy for the misguided. Now, Zionism didn't do any of that. Zionism said, oh, anti-Semitism is some irrational hatred we're never going to overcome. And the best thing we can do is just have our own country in Palestine. And, and remember, Theodore Herzl even wanted to convert Jews to Christianity. So, and then what else is related to Zionism? Vilifications, moral pontifications, hate speech laws, and none of these things actually overcome the fallacies. They can only intensify the hatreds. And that is why very easily, when we look at the history of involvement in the First World War, the Second World War, against the anti-Semitic Hitler, I get it, Hitler made anti-Jewish fallacies. But again, you can only overcome the fallacies through reason and logic, not just moral pontifications, violence, and so on. So that's it. I just see it as an error. And I believe that once we have enough people that say, wait a minute, yeah, we can get along. These are errors. There's no one to blame. The hard left and the whole nonsense about settler colonialism and how the Israelis are just a bunch of, racist, that's a mistake. The extreme right saying that the Jews are a bunch of, satanic conquerors, that too is a mistake. So I just think that once we see it as an error and we have sympathy for all sides, I do believe that we will be able to have one state and that we will be able to integrate. And now I share House's concern that if we just pull the plug and everybody lives in one state overnight, of course, there's going to be violence, retributions, all kinds of chaos. But with time, with enough beacons of intellectual leadership, we can, and with a slow transition towards the one state, we can eventually make it happen. So that's it. That's the
Thank you.
Version.
I appreciate that. And do you have other historical examples of ideological or intellectual errors that were corrected through reason and logic?
Yeah, the biggest one that we can learn the most from was socialism itself. How did the Soviet Union, we came very close to having nuclear wars and all kinds of disasters, but through reason and understanding and great education and decades of suffering. And I think in many ways, what we're seeing right now with Zionism is the same thing. We already had the new historians. We already had all these people showing the real history that it's not so simple. It's just, there's evil anti-Semites everywhere. We get to do whatever we want. And we have, look at the suffering. It's never-ending wars and chaos. So just like the Soviet Union, after much writing and reasoning, we had enough people in the Soviet Union, like Gorbachev, that finally said, okay, this is a mistake. I'm not going to clamp down on the dissident groups. We're just going to let the thing collapse. And I think this is what we're doing right now, little by little. But we need the right idea. So I think, again, a perfect example is looking at the Soviet Union. The patterns are the same. A lot of
but was the Soviet Union, did it collapse because they had debate around reason, or it collapsed because it was a system that didn't work, which created, which was essentially, if a system collapses, then people are then forced to then find and assess a new system. So they're almost forced to think of something new because the prior system didn't work. But how does that map onto Zionism, where they believe that Zionism is still the best of all other options, right? Like if Zionism fully collapses and Jews are kicked off the land and whatever, then they're like, okay, well, I guess Zionism, that's how you would kill Zionism. It wouldn't be through an intellectual conversation. It would need to be through actual actions that change the dynamics.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And we do not know how Zionism is going to end. I believe it is a flawed ideology that is sparking the chaos. And it could end that way. There could be a massive war. Maybe that the Iranians launch a bunch of missiles, or somebody FedExes a group or something, and then the whole thing collapses or something like that. But that's not what we want. And also when you look at the Soviet Union, it is true that the calamity, the continued chaos and the poverty and so on, brought it down. But it was also a very intellectual thing. When you look at the history of the Soviet Union, you can see that the ideas were spreading. Mikhail Gorbachev, a lot of people behind the scenes that they were his economic advisors, little by little, they knew that the whole thing was collapsing. That, I'm a big fan of the Austrian School of Economics, and I know Adam too, Mises and Hayek and those guys. And I think Milton Friedman, very famous Jewish economist, he even said that Friedrich Hayek's book, like The Road to Serfdom, did so much behind the scenes to change the climate that ultimately helped bring down the Soviet Union. So it's just a combination of many things. I mean, we want, and remember, I understand how a lot of Israelis are really concerned that they can't possibly see a way out. But remember, Russians today are way better off once the whole system collapsed and they have peace and free markets and trade.
Jorge, I'm getting up, but I still hear you. So just keep talking.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know how else I got into this tangent, but it is a combination of many things. It collapsed because of the economic chaos, and there was just enough revolutions. But again, the revolutions that were going on, they couldn't be clamped down by Gorbachev. Gorbachev knew that there were already a lot of little separate movements. People were not going along with the bureaucracy. He could have clamped down, and there were a lot of hardliners that were pushing him to clamp down, just like they clamped down in the Czech Republic, in the Hungarian Revolution. But we had enough suffering and enough minds were changed that the Soviets finally decided to let it collapse. And one of the very encouraging signs is that, remember, Putin was once a KGB agent. He was one of the people tasked with keeping the disastrous ideology going. Yet eventually Putin himself changed his mind. And he has written a lot about, how communism was a failed system and we needed to move towards free markets and so on. So Yoshi Cohen for a future leader of a one-state Israeli-Palestine solution. And he's one of the former Mossad chiefs. And I can totally see that. We just need to have that beacon.
Okay, well, in honor of what you said, I changed my shirt.
Oh my God, thanks.
You wanna give a little background?
No, you tell the story of that one.
So I actually met Jorge a few months ago in New York, and he gifted me the shirt. This is Ludwig von Mises. You just name dropped him, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a quote. It says, "All reasonable men are called upon." I'm reading it upside down. Are called upon to familiarize themselves with the teachings of economics. This is in our age the primary civic duty. Ludwig von Mises. Okay. Well, I'll wear this for the rest of the stream. I don't know anything about him or if I agree with his ideology. My views on economics, I think, are a little bit different from yours, but I am definitely open to your worldview. Like, I don't outright reject it. You very well might be right with your economic worldview. I'm just not as convinced that you're right as you are. But that's not the topic of today's conversation. So, given your thoughts on defeating this intellectual error with better ideas, how do you see that actually playing out in the Israel-Palestine paradigm when we are dominated and ruled by people who are very strong in their belief, which you find to be an intellectual error?
I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of progress made. Like I mentioned earlier, we have the new historians, even Benny Morris, who's very supportive of Zionism. I think he's done a great job of just getting us closer to the truth. And you have Ilya Papa. I mean, I understand some of these guys may have certain biases and so on, but there's enough history to know that we can change our minds, that we can see all this chaos as an error, and everything is because design is just like the Soviets. It's the same thing like the Soviets, right? The Soviets, they had their intellectuals, their historians, and to them, they had their own bias, they had their own theories, which were ultimately flawed, that created their own little echo chamber. And I just believe that the same thing has happened with the Zionists. But I think within the Zionist world, right, the new historians are Israeli themselves, right? If Jorge, some Cuban immigrant is telling you things, it's not going to be as impactful as Benny Morris, as Tom Segev, and all those guys. So I really do believe that the Israelis themselves have already shown that a lot of Zionism was just kind of a mistake. And I think it's just a matter of using all this chaos. There's more people are looking at this right now because of the chaos. And I just hope that with what you're doing and what Adam is doing, and there are many people out there trying to find a solution. And I just hope that we can coalesce something in time that can lead more people. And just like the Berlin Wall came down because a lot of people saw things differently, we can do it peacefully. And that's why I think it's so important to have some kind of one-state solution where we can show everyone how we can have a transition towards peace. I think that's a very important piece because as like I mentioned earlier, House brought up, if we just pull the plug tomorrow into some kind of one-state thing, it'll be total chaos. So we just have to keep, doing what we're doing here. But I think there's enough education already out there.
But you mentioned the new historians, but the new historians are either, some are Zionist, others are just considered radical figures that have no respect amongst Israeli society. So the new historians are not like these prominent, influential figures in Israel. When you look at the whole political class, the media class, the intellectual class in Israel, they're all very Zionist. They're not having conversations about it being an intellectual error. It's a close to non-existent conversation amongst Israelis. So given this being the current state, how do you actually generate this conversation? I would say it's a conversation happening abroad, right? But it's certainly not happening within Israel.
Yeah, I'm curious, and maybe you can elaborate, like maybe how popular is someone like a Benny Morris? It is true that Benny Morris is still like a Zionist, but I'm sure Benny Morris he's very critical, of Israeli history, and he would be far more sympathetic towards some kind of future one-state solution. I have a feeling he would be. But I do think that if we can just
Benny Morris is the most Zionist of all the new historians, and he's the most respected of them. That's not a coincidence. But he would not support a one binational state. That's not. Benny Morse wouldn't.
Now,
wouldn't support that.
It's very, right now we're seeing, and this has been discussed a lot, how there is a growing split between the Jews in the United States, like the New York Jews, who voted for Mandani. You know, so, and I remember a little while ago, there was an article where some Zionists, you know, some Israeli Jews were very upset about the New York American Jews for not being Zionist enough, being patriotic enough, and that kind of thing. So I really do believe that if we can just get a movement within the New York, you know, the American Jews, that is far more sympathetic towards the one-state solution, once we win those guys over, it's over. It's all about changing minds, but I do think that within the United States, especially in New York, where the Jews here get along, you know, with everybody else.
Yeah.
Well,
you know what? So I would say the stronger, what strengthens your point is that American Jews over time are understanding Zionism to be a bad idea. That's true. So I think there's a case to be made that we're seeing this happening in the United States amongst Jews and amongst just Americans in general, and Westerners in general. It's not happening within Israel. So now we need to see how the views of the international community can directly impact the actions of Israel, which I think they certainly can. But I think that should probably be our focus, because the conversation within Israel is close to non-existent. The Overton window is like very, very narrow. Like the media in Israel is considered left-wing to Israelis. Like Israelis would say most media is left-wing. If you were to watch it, you would think it's like far-right, fascist. Like it's so far from left-wing. The only thing that's left about it is that it's like anti-Bibi, but there's nothing left-wing about it. But in Israel, it's still considered to be liberal media. So it's interesting. But there is no real liberal media in Israel. Well, that's not true. You do have the human rights organizations like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence and 972 Magazine and Haaretz. So that you do have them. That's true. Yeah, Haaretz. And interesting, my whole family is very right-wing. My grandfather, he's like an older generation intellectual, also very right-wing, but he reads Haaretz every day. That's the newspaper he reads. And the reason he reads it is because he finds them to be the most sophisticated. So he doesn't agree with them. He strongly disagrees with their left-wing spin, but he says they're just classier, they're more sophisticated than a lot of the right-wing ones. So it's interesting that he reads it. So I take that back. When I said there's no left-wing media, I'm talking about like news, like the actual news that you watch. But in terms of publications, right, you do have Haaretz and 972, and they would be solidly left. And yeah. Anyways,
and it doesn't have to be a left or right thing. I mean, there's a lot of right, very like religious Jews. There's a lot of Jews that really believe in private property, equal rights for everyone. I'm sure there's a lot of those in Israel too. I think you know better than me.
Yeah. Cool. Well, any final thoughts before we bring? No,
thanks a lot for.
Awesome, Jorge. This was great. Thanks for having on.